found brutally murdered in the basement of her home. It looked as if the killer had committed the perfect crime. But years later, investigators noticed something on a crime scene photograph that had previously been overlooked. The killer had left behind a clue.
Struggle, a death struggle in the basement, and
that Carla Brown was home and alone on the day of the murder. And who would have felt free to spend so much time in the home cleaning up and staging the scene? The autopsy report on Carla Brown indicated death by strangulation. Although she was found nude from the waist down, there were no signs of sexual assault. Investigators were convinced that the killer spent a great deal of time in the house after the murder staging the crime scene.
I didn't know Mark very well, although they had dated for a number of years, off and on. And there were times in their relationship that it wasn't great, but she seemed to always be crazy about him anyway.
Other leads. Police asked the FBI for a psychological profile of the killer and turned to FBI behavioral analyst John Douglas.
In my research, we began to break down crimes by disorganized and organized. Disorganized means extremely sloppy, carelessness on the part of the offender. The crime could be very, very impulsive. Organized means that there's a high degree, a high level of criminal sophistication on the part of the subject.
To Douglas, this crime scene was disorganized, an indication that the killer was inexperienced and probably had never killed before. He came to the home with no intention of committing murder, but did so after some sort of confrontation or rejection. Since he spent so much time inside the home, Douglas believed that he was familiar with the victim and her routine and might be living in the neighborhood or very close by. Douglas said the killer was an unmarried white male in his mid to late 20s, high school educated, with a sloppy appearance. The use of electrical cord to tie the victim's hands indicated the killer had taken shop classes or had interviewed the murderer, and that he was capable of passing a polygraph test.
And then it got kind of spooky. I mean, I was sitting there and I wasn't sure I was believing what he was saying after a certain point. He started talking about how this individual would react and what kind of vehicle he'd talking about. A Volkswagen. There was a high probability this guy would be driving a Volkswagen, and that it would be red or orange in color.
This led investigators to focus once again on the two men sitting next door on the day Carla Brown and her fiancé were moving in. But investigators needed more than just a psychological profile. They needed hard evidence.
He was hit in the head with. This TV tray was lying on the floor within 3 foot of the victim, where she had probably been on the couch, but I had missed it.
The tray tables were still in storage, untouched in the 2 years since the murder. In an extraordinary piece of luck, microscopic traces of blood and hair still present on the tray table. And what Dr. Campbell said next was even more revealing.
He says, "What about the bite mark?" And I said, "Bite mark? What bite mark? What are you talking about?"
When we looked at the photograph and went ahead and enhanced it and magnified it, present on the shoulder was a bite injury on the shoulder. And by looking at that bite injury, you could actually pick out individual teeth all the way across.
I mean, I'd trade that for 5 eyewitnesses anytime. So eyewitnesses can make mistakes, things like fingerprints don't. And it was my understanding that bite marks properly preserved with an identified defendant.
The killer had left behind a clue. All investigators needed now was a suspect. 2 years after the brutal murder of 22-year-old Carla Brown, investigators got the break they needed when a photographic enhancement revealed a bite mark on Carla's shoulder. Police now turned. The police were the only ones inside the house after Carla Brown's body was found.
And that was a shock to us as police officers, because
A very wonderful person who had a lot to offer, and a family who cared very much about Carla, and that it was very, very selfish of him to not consider another person's life as something that can just be thrown away on a particular day.
He got caught because the techniques of investigation and law enforcement completely overpowered him. He got away with the crime because he was lucky. He got caught.
Don Weber, along with journalist Charles Bosworth, chronicled the many ups and downs of this case in a best-selling book, Silent Witness.
Carla's family was so intrigued by the bite mark evidence that she embroidered a little tapestry that she presented to Don Weber as a token of her appreciation. And it offers the slogan that Don had used, that you can lie through your teeth, but your teeth don't lie. And around the border is the pattern of rectangle, space, triangle, which is the bite mark pattern that Don had proved had been made by John Prantty.
On the morning of February 20th, 1989, something terrible happened to Janice Johnson, a 35-year-old housewife and mother of 2 children.
Claire, I gotta go. I'll talk to you later, okay?
The investigation into that morning's events would raise questions that persist to the... Clayton and Janice Johnson lived in the tiny coastal fishing village of Shelburne, Nova Scotia. It's a close-knit community where townspeople all know one another. For the Johnsons, Shelburne was the ideal place to raise their two young daughters, 11-year-old Darla and 9-year-old Dawn.
We had two lovely girls, and perfect as far as I was concerned. We were always together. Like, you can ask anybody around the community, whenever they've seen us, the four of us usually always together. Very, very rarely we ever went anywhere individually.
Clayton was an industrial arts teacher at the local high school. Janice was a homemaker. The Johnsons were a deeply religious family and very active in their church, volunteering much of their free time to church activities.
We were always out visiting people and doing this and that. My mom was the type of person that she didn't like to just sit around and do nothing, so we were always busy doing something. And we never went anywhere without doing it as a family.
Janice had sustained severe head injuries from what was assumed to be an accidental fall down the basement steps. Despite the best of medical treatment, Janice died of her head wounds several hours later. She was just 35 years old.
I think it was the first time I ever seen my father cry. My first reaction was that it wasn't real. Like, you want to believe it didn't happen.
That's one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, is to tell the two girls that their mother passed away.
The small community of Shelburne rallied around Clayton Johnson and his two daughters as they paid their last respects to a loving wife and mother. But that support soon crumbled when Clayton Johnson started dating a woman 30 years his junior. After Janice Johnson's death, the chief medical examiner, Dr. Roland Perry, performed an autopsy. He was hampered to some extent by the fact that there were no photographs of the accident scene. In a misguided effort to be helpful, two family friends had washed the blood from the basement before photographs could be taken. This is a police video shot later as the women described the blood stains. They said there was a small blood stain on the floor at the bottom of the steps and a blood stain with bloody hair on the concrete wall next to the third step. This recreation shows the position of Janice Johnson's body when paramedics arrived. Her head was on the floor. Her leg was above her head on the step. In her left hand, she was holding her car keys. Although Dr. Perry found Janice Johnson's wounds to be unusual, he ruled the death a freak accident concluding that she had fallen forward down the steps to her death. He suspected that her skull had become wedged in a 5.5-inch space between the wooden steps and the adjoining concrete wall, which crushed both sides of her head. When she landed on the concrete floor, she sustained the wound to the top of her head. Since Janice Johnson was thought to be in the house alone at the time of the incident, foul play was ruled out. Janice was on the telephone with Claire Thompson, who said she heard Clayton kiss Janice goodbye before leaving for work.
You think, I don't know about. Well, you better look for me.
Claire Thompson said they talked for 10 minutes and that the call ended around 7:50.
Oh, sure. Okay, talk to you then. Bye.
Witnesses saw Clayton Johnson at the gas station at the same time. A minute or two later, a neighbor found Janice in the basement and called paramedics. The call was logged in at 7:52.
That was, so to speak, the end of that. Of course, Clayton and his daughters had to deal with the great loss that they had suffered. It was only after some 18 months had passed that Clayton really made what might be called a dreadful mistake.
Clayton Johnson's mistake was to fall in love. Soon after Janice's death, Clayton started dating and later married 22-year-old Tina Waybritt. She was a member of the Johnsons' church and was 30 years his junior. In the close-knit conservative community of Shelburne, this new relationship raised a few eyebrows. Police also discovered that Clayton Johnson had purchased a $120,000 life insurance policy on Janice 2 months before she died. A background check revealed that Clayton Johnson was also having financial difficulties and that utility services were sometimes cut off in their home for non-payment.
And pretty soon, fact became confused with rumor, rumor with fact, and the more people talked, the more people wondered whether this lovable teddy bear Clayton Johnson was a wife killer.
So police decided to reopen their investigation into Janice Johnson's death. Homicide investigators went back to re-interview the woman who cleaned up the blood after Janice Johnson's death. To their surprise, 2 years later, one of the women recalled seeing more blood in the basement than she originally reported. On the walls, across the length of the floor, and on piles of lumber along the far wall. Investigators took this new information, along with the autopsy photos, to two of Canada's most respected pathologists. 3 years after his wife's death, Clayton Johnson was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Johnson pleaded not guilty to the charge. Prosecutors introduced a new blood-spatter testimony and also raised the issue of Johnson's new love interest.
Clayton Johnson was on trial for events that happened after the accident. He was on trial for the insurance monies that he collected. He was on trial for this new girlfriend that he had move in with him.
Clayton Johnson was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison.
I don't know how yet I stood up. I could feel my knees and everything get weak, and I took all my power was just keep standing up, not falling down. It was a shock, I'll tell you.
Have you ever felt like you were reading a book? It's what it seemed like. It didn't seem like it could be happening in my life.
Johnson was ordered to serve his sentence in the Atlantic Maximum Security Institution. From there, he contacted the Association in Defense of the Wrongfully Convicted in Toronto. His story caught the attention of the director of the organization, James Lockyer.
As you go back through the miscarriages of justice in both our country in Canada, that is, in the United States, and in England, very often, probably as often as 40 to 50% of the time, bad science has played a significant role in a wrongful conviction.
But the first thing Lockyer noticed wasn't just questionable science. It was a problem with the timeline. Claire Thompson said she was on the telephone with Janice Johnson on the morning of her death. In her original statement, Thompson said she heard Clayton kiss Janice goodbye at approximately 7:40. She said the call with Janice lasted 10 minutes until about 7:50. A witness said Clayton Johnson was at the gas station at the same time, 7:50, when Claire Thompson said she was ending her call to Janice. The neighbor found Janice's body and called paramedics at 7:52. Clayton was aware that Janice was expecting company that morning.
Any theory that he would kill his wife in a time span of seconds or minutes when he could legitimately expect 3 different people to show up at the house in that very time that he was supposedly assaulting his wife. You put all that together, the theory he killed his wife was, in my view, completely ridiculous.
Blood spatter expert Herb McDonnell was also skeptical. He believes that the witness's original statements were probably the most accurate.
The neighbors at that time reported that the blood was consistent with an accident. Now, obviously, they're not qualified to interpret bloodstain patterns, but had they seen a lot of spattering, or if they'd seen blood up on the walls and ceiling, I think at that time, even though they were cleaning it up, they would have a clear recollection of what it looked like, and especially where they washed it up.
Another story that changed was Claire Thompson's. In her original statement, she said she called Janice around 7:40 and that the call lasted for 10 minutes. 2 years later, she said she may have called closer to 7:30. This created the window of opportunity for Johnson to have murdered his wife. James Lockyer asked 2 forensic pathologists to review the forensic evidence independently, Dr. Linda Norton of Dallas, Texas, and Dr. James Ferris of Vancouver. They both examined the case file and autopsy photos, and it was what they didn't see that they found most intriguing.
There are no defense wounds, and in a bludgeoning of this nature, considering the location of the head wounds, one would expect to see defensive wounds if this were an actual bludgeoning death.
During an attack, most individuals instinctively raise their hands to protect themselves. As a result, their hands and forearms sustain injuries.
There's absolutely no evidence that any of the injuries were as a result of some form of homicidal assault.
Janice Johnson's car keys were in her hand when paramedics arrived. The lack of arm wounds and the car keys also cast doubt on the original forensic report, which stated that Janice fell forwards down the steps.
What occurred is that she slipped at the top of the stairs and she fell backwards instead of forwards. And of course, most falls down the stairs are forward falls. Backward falls are uncommon, and I think that's what led to an awful lot of the misinterpretation that occurred in this case.
Clayton Johnson's new defense team now had 2 major hurdles. First, to prove to the court that Johnson was innocent, and also to show how Janice Johnson really died. By the time Clayton Johnson's new defense team gathered their information, he had spent 6 years behind bars. It was a life Johnson had no choice but to get used to.
It's a whole new ballgame as far as your change of lifestyle, the whole thing. You know, it's a rude awakening.
Johnson's team of forensic experts did not believe that his wife's injuries were consistent with a bludgeoning death, and they did not think that she had fallen forwards as was originally reported. They believed that Janice had fallen backwards. To get Johnson's conviction overturned, his lawyers needed to find a way to show how the accident really happened. They turned to blood spatter expert Herb McDonald, but after studying the case file, McDonald couldn't figure out a way to recreate an accidental fall down the basement steps.
The very night that I was about ready to call James Lockyer and advise him that I could not do my recreation, and I've done many of these reconstructions or recreations, if you like, I was very disappointed, and I was about to tell him that I just couldn't do it. And that night I read the morning paper. I frequently don't read the paper until a day late. And on the front page, here's Peter Pan at West High School. And of course I thought, hey.
I'm flying, flying, flying. Look at me way up high, suddenly, here am I, I'm flying.
In the production of the musical Peter Pan, various characters fly across the stage in a harness. McDonald called the high school, borrowed the transom and the operator, and hired a model the same height and weight as Janice Johnson. McDonald then built a replica of the Johnsons' basement steps. He videotaped the entire procedure and put blue chalk on the wall and step where witnesses saw the blood. With the model at the top of the steps, she fell backwards. When her head fell into the gap in between the third step and the concrete wall, the chalk marks on the model's head were consistent with the injuries found on Janice Johnson.
There's no question that that is a good explanation for how the wounds on Janet Johnson occurred over her right ear.
It's remarkable when you see it because the blue marks appear on the model's head exactly where the injuries are found on Janice's left and right temples.
James Lockyer believes that Janice Johnson was still on the telephone when Clayton was at the gas station.
And then what are you gonna do?
And that the call ended at 7:50, just as her neighbor was arriving at the house.
You know, I've gotta go. I'll talk to you later.
She grabbed her car keys, ran up the steps, and lost her footing. As she fell backwards, her head became wedged in the 5.5-inch gap between the step and the cement wall. Her feet pulled her head from the gap, flipping her body over onto the basement floor, producing the gash found on the top of her head. When all of this information came to light, Canadian prosecutors took the unusual step of releasing Clayton Johnson from prison. He had spent 6 years behind bars.
I'm just very happy to get back with my family. I'm very pleased with the decision of Justice Freeman. And I couldn't ask for a better legal team than what I've got. And I just want to get back with my family.
I'm really happy right now because that means my dad's actually going to see me graduate. I've got my father back in my life.
Although authorities have made no final decisions about the case, and there's always the chance of a retrial, many believe it will simply be dismissed. For a crime forensic experts say didn't happen, 6 years in prison is enough.
Oh, that's quite right, indeed. Clayton Johnson wasn't convicted of a murder that he didn't commit. He was convicted of a murder that never happened.
We've made an error, so once you recognize you've made an error, you do the best you can to rectify it. And the best way to rectify this case is simply to acquit this man, exonerate him, and let him go on with his life.
Well, I was getting all different opinions as far as, the justice system is concerned. Because, I've always been brought up right from the time I could more or less walk around that, the police were your friend, that you held them on a certain level. And Just after going through this, it makes you think twice.
I still remember the headline that made grown men stop talking mid-sentence. Michigan 1976 cold case solved. Decades-old mystery ends with surprise arrest. 6 words that traveled faster than winter wind across Iron County. 6 words that reopened old nightmares, forced retired deputies back into pressed uniforms, and made an entire town question whether memory had protected them or betrayed them for nearly half a century. Because some mysteries do not die. They wait. They sit quietly beneath fresh pavement and new generations. They survive inside family albums, forgotten police boxes, and the minds of people who convinced themselves that silence was the same thing as peace. And on the night of November 14th, 1976, peace disappeared from the town of Blackridge, Michigan. The cold arrived early that year. Residents still talk about it. The kind of cold that turns breath into smoke and sound into something distant and unnatural. Snow had fallen 3 days before Thanksgiving preparations began. The streets glistened beneath orange lamps. The forests surrounding the town looked endless, ancient, almost watchful. Blackridge was small. 7,000 people. 1 diner. 1 high school. 2 churches. Everyone knew everyone. Or believed they did. The victim was 24-year-old Eleanor Hayes. A school librarian. Quiet. Intelligent. The sort of woman neighbors described with the same words over and over again. Kind. Reliable. Impossible to dislike. She lived alone in a modest white house near Cedar Avenue. She attended church every Sunday. She volunteered at literacy programs. She remembered birthdays. She baked pies for elderly neighbors. Nothing in her life suggested danger. Nothing suggested enemies. Nothing suggested the kind of violence that would freeze an entire community in place. Yet at 10:47 p.m. on November 14th, everything changed. A passing truck driver noticed Eleanor's blue Chevrolet parked near Pine Hollow Road, nearly 6 miles outside town. Headlights off. Driver's door slightly open. Engine cold. No sign of its owner. The location itself made no sense. Pine Hollow Road wasn't a shortcut. It wasn't scenic. It led toward abandoned logging territory that few residents visited after sunset. Deputies arrived 22 minutes later. The air temperature had dropped below freezing. Fresh snow covered the shoulders of the road. No obvious footprints. No struggle visible beneath flashlight beams. Only Eleanor's vehicle. Her purse remained inside. Car keys missing. Coat gone. Everything else untouched. The radio still played softly. An old country song fading in and out through static. Sheriff Thomas Brennan later described the atmosphere in one sentence. It felt like somebody had pressed pause on reality. Search teams mobilized before midnight. Volunteers emerged from warm homes carrying lanterns and hunting flashlights. Church bells rang. Parents kept children indoors. The entire town understood immediately that something terrible had happened. People vanish in cities. Not in Blackridge. Not here. Not Eleanor Hayes. Not the woman who organized reading circles for first graders. The search continued until sunrise. Nothing. No footprints. No blood. No discarded belongings. No witnesses. The forest absorbed everything. Morning newspapers used cautious language. Missing local woman. Authorities investigating. Community concerned. By evening, the tone changed. Mysterious disappearance shocks Michigan town. Cold weather hampers search efforts. Fear spreads through Blackridge. Residents locked doors for the first time in years. The diner closed early. Church attendance doubled. Rumors multiplied. Someone claimed Eleanor argued with an unknown man 2 weeks earlier. Another insisted she planned to leave Michigan entirely. A third believed she witnessed something she shouldn't have seen. None of it survived investigation. Detectives from the state police arrived 48 hours later. Among them was a young investigator named Robert Kellerman, 31 years old. Ambitious. Methodical. The kind of detective who carried 3 notebooks and trusted evidence more than instinct. He would spend the next 30 years haunted by Eleanor Hayes. Though he couldn't know that yet. At first, the case seemed straightforward. Reconstruct the final day. Identify contacts. Establish movement. Find the missing piece. Eleanor left work at 4 in the afternoon. Visited Miller's grocery at 5:12 p.m. Purchased soup ingredients, bread, and coffee. Neighbors saw her home before sunset. At approximately 8:15 p.m., she received a phone call. That detail changed everything. Her sister, Margaret, spoke with investigators 2 days later. Eleanor sounded distracted, not frightened, not upset, simply thoughtful. Margaret remembered asking if something was wrong. Eleanor laughed, a short laugh, nervous. Then came the sentence that would echo through decades of investigation. Some people return when you least expect them. Nothing more. Margaret assumed an old friend had reached out. Perhaps someone from college. Perhaps a former neighbor. Ordinary life. Ordinary conversation. Hours later, Eleanor vanished. Detectives traced incoming calls. Technology in 1976 offered little mercy. Manual records. Incomplete exchanges. Missing documentation. One call stood apart. Placed from a public payphone near the old railway station. Duration, 11 minutes. Identity unknown. The voice on the other end disappeared into history before investigators even knew what questions to ask. The newspapers seized upon the mystery immediately. Mysterious caller linked to disappearance. Michigan woman vanishes after strange conversation. Cold case fears emerge as clues run dry. Fear spread faster than facts. Winter tightened its grip on Blackridge. Volunteers searched frozen fields. Divers examined icy rivers. Helicopters scanned forests stripped bare by November winds. Nothing. The town entered a state somewhere between mourning and denial. People still expected Eleanor to return. Any day now. Any moment. The alternative remained unbearable. Then came December 3rd. 19 days after Eleanor vanished. A hunter discovered something unusual near the abandoned Marlow logging camp. Not a body. Not evidence of violence. A single red scarf hanging from a broken pine branch. The scarf belonged to Eleanor. Her sister identified it instantly. Handmade. Christmas gift from 2 years earlier. Investigators rushed to the scene. Hope collided with dread. Search teams expanded outward. Dogs tracked scents through frozen terrain. Again, nothing. No Eleanor. No suspect. Only the scarf.
Clean.
Undamaged. Placed carefully. Almost deliberately. The detail unsettled everyone. Accidents leave chaos. Violence leaves disorder. This felt different. Intentional. Controlled. As though somebody wanted the scarf discovered. As though somebody understood exactly how grief functions. Sheriff Brennan addressed reporters beneath gray winter skies. "We are pursuing every lead." The statement sounded increasingly hollow, because there were no leads, only questions. The people of Blackridge developed rituals. Porch lights remained on overnight. Church groups organized prayer circles. Children walked to school in groups. Parents whispered after dark. The disappearance became part of daily existence. A wound without visible edges. Meanwhile, Robert Kellerman refused surrender. He interviewed everyone. Former classmates, co-workers, church members, old boyfriends, delivery drivers, gas station attendants. Hundreds of conversations. Thousands of pages. Patterns emerged, then vanished. One detail continued returning. People described Eleanor as if she carried something private during the final months of her life. Not fear. Anticipation. She had been sorting old photographs, writing letters, reconnecting with individuals she hadn't spoken to in years. One coworker remembered Eleanor requesting archived newspapers from 1958 and 1959. Local editions, community pages, school announcements.
Why?
Nobody knew. Another remembered her asking strange questions about former residents who had long since moved away. Again, the same unsettling theme.
The past.
Always the past. Robert Kellerman noticed it, wrote it down, circled it. But 1976 investigations revolved around immediate threats, current relationships, recent conflicts. The idea that a disappearance might originate decades earlier felt almost absurd. So the note remained buried inside his files. The winter of 1977 arrived without answers. The official classification changed. Missing person. Presumed victim of foul play. No suspects identified. No arrests made. Blackridge hated the terminology. Presumed. People cling to uncertainty when certainty hurts too much. Margaret Hayes continued setting an extra place at family dinners. Eleanor's mother refused moving belongings from her bedroom. Hope became routine. Routine became survival. Then came the anonymous letter, postmarked January 18th. No return address. Typed on ordinary paper. 8 words. She went looking for what should have stayed buried. Nothing else. No signature. No fingerprints investigators could identify. The entire town erupted. Buried? What was buried? A secret? A memory? A crime? The wording ignited rumors that lasted generations. Some claimed Eleanor discovered corruption involving local officials. Others believed old family disputes resurfaced. A few whispered about forgotten tragedies hidden beneath Blackridge's respectable image. Robert Kellerman kept returning to one possibility. What if buried meant exactly what it sounded like? Not objects, not bodies. Memories.
History.
People often bury memories long before they bury anything else. Yet without evidence, intuition meant little. The investigation stalled. Months became years. New cases emerged. New tragedies demanded attention. The file labeled Hayes, Eleanor grew heavier and colder. Still unsolved. Still waiting. Still impossible to forget. Because Blackridge wasn't merely missing a resident. It was missing certainty. And uncertainty changes communities forever. By the end of 1977, children no longer played near Pine Hollow Road. Drivers accelerated through the area without explanation. Hunters avoided Marlow logging camp. The landscape itself absorbed fear. Places remember. People remember. Sometimes memory becomes more powerful than truth. And somewhere beyond the frozen forests, beyond newspaper headlines and exhausted investigators, one person carried knowledge capable of ending the nightmare. One person understood why Eleanor Hayes answered that mysterious phone call. One person knew who had returned after all those years. One person understood what she went looking for. And why some secrets, once disturbed, refused to remain buried beneath the weight of ordinary lives. The spring thaw of 1977 brought mud, dead leaves, and absolutely no answers. Snow melted from Pine Hollow Road. The ground softened. Investigators returned with renewed optimism. Winter had concealed things. Spring, they hoped, might reveal them. It revealed nothing. No additional tracks. No discarded evidence. No hidden graves. Only wet earth and silence. The silence infuriated Robert Kellerman, 24 years old, beloved by the community, gone without explanation. Human beings leave traces. They always do. Yet Eleanor Hayes seemed to have stepped out of existence itself. The anonymous letter remained the only new development. 8 words. She went looking for what should have stayed buried. Kellerman read them repeatedly. The sentence possessed confidence. Not panic. Not rage. Confidence. The writer believed something had been hidden intentionally. Something dangerous. Something old. The language sounded less like a threat and more like a warning delivered too late. He pinned the letter beside photographs of Eleanor. Every morning he looked at both. Every evening, he left frustrated. Meanwhile, Blackridge attempted normal life. Attempted. The word mattered, because normality had become performance. Church attendance remained unusually high. Businesses closed earlier. Women avoided driving alone after dark. Parents established curfews stricter than anything children remembered. Fear changes routines before people consciously acknowledge fear itself. Margaret Hayes noticed another transformation. People spoke differently around her.
Softer.
Carefully, as though Eleanor already belonged to memory rather than possibility. Margaret refused acceptance. She still expected the telephone to ring, still imagined footsteps on the porch, still preserved hope with a stubbornness bordering on sacred devotion. One evening in April, she discovered something inside Eleanor's house that investigators had previously overlooked. A cardboard box beneath the guest room bed. Ordinary, dust-covered, forgotten. Inside rested dozens of photographs. Most depicted family gatherings, school functions, church picnics. Nothing unusual. Then came another collection. Older, black and white, late 1950s. Young people standing beside Lake Mercer during community events. Teenagers smiling at county fairs. School dances. Volunteer programs. Margaret recognized almost everyone, including Eleanor, a child, 8 or 9 years old. And beside her, in photograph after photograph, stood another family, the Whitmores. The name meant little to younger residents, but older generations remembered. The Whitmores once represented influence, business owners, landowners, founders. Then, abruptly, they left Blackridge in 1960. No farewell celebrations, no community gatherings, simply gone. The photographs fascinated Kellerman because Eleanor had organized them meticulously. Dates written on backs, names identified, certain images marked with red pencil circles, specific faces, specific moments, almost as though she had been conducting research. One photograph attracted immediate attention. Summer Festival, August 1959. Children gathered near a wooden stage. Most smiled toward the camera. One boy did not. Thomas Whitmore, age 14, standing slightly apart, watching Eleanor. Not hostile, not friendly, just watching. On the back, Eleanor had written 4 words. He remembered everything. Kellerman felt a chill. He remembered everything. What exactly had Thomas Whitmore remembered? And why did Eleanor know it decades later? The investigation reopened forgotten histories. Former residents received phone calls. Old newspaper archives were examined. Dust-covered municipal records emerged from storage. The Whitmore family became a subject of renewed curiosity. Harold Whitmore, father, successful lumber businessman, respected, powerful. His wife, Eleanor Whitmore, organized charity events throughout the county. Their son, Thomas, left Michigan shortly after graduating high school. No criminal record, no controversy, no obvious scandal. Yet conversations about the family always ended strangely. People hesitated, changed subjects, remembered selectively. The pattern disturbed Kellerman. Communities forget naturally. Selective forgetting feels different. Intentional. One retired teacher finally offered a sentence that stayed with investigators. Some families carry storms inside their walls. No elaboration. No specifics. Just that. Storms inside their walls. The spring months passed without progress. Newspaper interest faded. State police resources diminished. The case threatened to slide into permanent limbo. Then came June. And with it, another shock. A waitress at Miller's Diner remembered something previously dismissed as insignificant. On November 13th, the day before Eleanor disappeared, an unfamiliar man entered the establishment shortly after lunch. Well-dressed, mid-40s, polite, out-of-town accent. He asked questions. Not about restaurants, not about hotels, about families, specifically the Whitmores. Had anyone remained in Blackridge? Did locals still remember them? The waitress found the questions odd. The family left nearly 2 decades earlier. Why would anyone care? The man thanked her, ordered coffee, sat alone for 30 minutes, then left. No vehicle description, no name, nothing useful, except timing. One day before Eleanor vanished. The coincidence felt impossible to ignore. Kellerman pursued every lead. Travel records, hotels, Car rentals. Nothing. The stranger dissolved into uncertainty. Another ghost. Another unanswered question. Summer arrived. The forests surrounding Blackridge grew thick and green. Tourists returned. Children played outdoors. Life performed its annual ritual of renewal. But beneath the surface, fear remained. Pine Hollow Road acquired a reputation. Teenagers dared one another to drive there at night. Hunters exchanged stories. Locals avoided eye contact when the location arose in conversation. Places accumulate meaning. Sometimes tragedy writes that meaning permanently. Margaret Hayes continued sorting Eleanor's belongings. Grief expressed itself through organization. One afternoon, she discovered a notebook hidden inside a kitchen cabinet. Not a diary. Not exactly. More like research notes. Dates. Names. Questions. References to newspaper articles from 1958. Mentions of community meetings. The handwriting became increasingly hurried toward the final pages. And then, one sentence. Underlined twice. Everybody agreed to forget, but somebody never did. Kellerman stared at the words for several minutes. Forget what? Who never forgot? The language echoed the anonymous letter. Buried things. Remembered things. Old things refusing to remain old. The investigation was changing shape. No longer centered exclusively on November 1976. Now it stretched backward. Into childhood. Into local history. Into relationships that predated Eleanor's adulthood entirely. The realization both excited and terrified him. Because history possesses infinite corridors. One memory leads to another. One forgotten event reveals 10 more questions. Cold cases often drown in the sheer weight of the past. Autumn approached. Nearly a year had passed. No arrests. No body. No definitive evidence. The state prepared to reduce active involvement. Sheriff Brennan objected publicly. Privately, he understood reality. Resources follow solvable cases. Eleanor Hayes remained painfully unsolvable. Yet Robert Kellerman refused surrender. He visited the old Whitmore property one rainy October afternoon. The house stood abandoned. Windows boarded. Nature reclaiming wooden structures with patient determination. Locals avoided the place. Stories circulated. Most were nonsense. But fear rarely requires accuracy. Inside, dust covered everything. Nothing suggested criminal activity. Nothing suggested hidden truths. And yet, one room drew his attention. A small study overlooking the tree line. Bookshelves remained intact. Most contents had been removed years earlier, except for a single item, wedged behind loose boards. Forgotten. Waiting. A photograph. Faded. Damaged. Summer Festival, 1959. The same event Eleanor had catalogued. Children gathered near the stage. Thomas Whitmore standing apart. Watching. On the back, written in different handwriting. Some promises outlived childhood. The words struck like lightning. Promises. Buried things. Forgotten things. Remembered things. The entire mystery seemed constructed from memory itself. Kellerman drove back to Blackridge beneath darkening skies. For the first time since Eleanor disappeared, he felt something dangerous. Not certainty. Direction. The past mattered. Profoundly. Eleanor wasn't randomly researching old photographs. She wasn't accidentally revisiting community history. She had been looking for something. Following threads nobody else considered important. And someone noticed. Someone understood exactly what she was uncovering. That possibility terrified him more than any unknown attacker. Because strangers create fear. Shared history creates silence. And silence, once protected by an entire town, becomes nearly impossible to break. As Winter prepared to return to Michigan, Robert Kellerman wrote a sentence in his notebook that colleagues dismissed as intuition rather than evidence. Eleanor Hayes disappeared because she remembered something differently than everyone else. He couldn't prove it. Not then. Perhaps not ever. But deep inside, he understood a truth that would haunt him for decades. The answers were never hiding in the forests surrounding Pine Hollow Road. They were hiding inside memories older than the investigation itself. Memories somebody had spent 18 years carefully keeping buried.
Par.
The second winter without Eleanor Hayes felt colder than the first. Not because temperatures dropped lower, because hope did. By January of 1978, Blackridge had learned how to function around absence. The town no longer stopped when her name appeared in conversation. People simply lowered their voices, looked away,
Continued eating. Continued living.
Grief had become infrastructure.
Permanent.
Invisible. Every community eventually develops rules for surviving unresolved tragedy. Blackridge developed silence. Robert Kellerman refused to participate. The young detective had filled 3 entire filing cabinets with interviews, photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten theories. Most investigators saw a missing woman. Kellerman saw a collision between past and present. The anonymous letter. The Whitmore photographs. The mysterious visitor at Miller's Diner. The notes Eleanor left behind. They all pointed in one direction.
Backward.
Toward 1959. Toward promises nobody wanted to discuss. Toward memories powerful enough to remain dangerous after nearly 20 years. He began reconstructing Eleanor's childhood. Not her adult life. Her childhood. The decision puzzled colleagues. But instinct had stopped being optional. Traditional methods produced nothing. The past, however, kept whispering. School records revealed Eleanor and Thomas Whitmore attended the same elementary classes for 6 consecutive years. Neighbors remembered them together constantly. Fishing near Lake Mercer. Helping during church festivals. Participating in summer reading programs. They were inseparable. Then, abruptly, everything changed. The Whitmores left town. The friendship ended. No explanations.
No farewells.
No correspondence anyone knew about. Just absence. Another disappearance. Another silence. Margaret Hayes struggled to remember details. Time reshapes childhood. Still, she recalled one peculiar event. The summer before the Whitmores departed, Eleanor cried for days. Not ordinary childhood sadness. Something deeper. Something confusing. When Margaret asked what happened, Eleanor answered with a sentence children rarely invent. Sometimes adults decide which memories are allowed to stay. Margaret had been 10 years old. She never forgot the words. Neither did Robert Kellerman. Adults decide which memories are allowed to stay. The sentence fit everything. Perfectly. Too perfectly. Spring approached. Snow retreated. Roads reopened. And with the changing season came an unexpected witness. Arthur Malloy, 76 years old. Retired pastor. Failing health. Sharp memory. He requested a private meeting.
No recordings.
No reporters. Just conversation. The old man sat quietly for several minutes before speaking. The Whitmores didn't leave because they wanted to. Silence filled the room. Kellerman leaned forward. Arthur continued. Community leaders encouraged the departure. Nothing official. Nothing documented. An understanding. A mutual agreement. Families sometimes relocate to preserve peace. The language sounded familiar.
Preserve peace.
Mercy over truth. Different words. Same philosophy. The detective pressed carefully.
Why?
Arthur hesitated. His hands trembled. Then came another fragment. There was an incident involving children. No crime. No violence. But after it happened, people chose a story that made life easier. A story, not truth. A story. The distinction struck like thunder. Who created the story? Who benefited from it? Arthur refused specifics. Not out of malice. Out of age. Memory itself had become uncertain. Yet one conviction remained. Thomas Whitmore carried blame for something he didn't do. And Eleanor Hayes never believed it. The revelation changed everything. Because Eleanor's adult obsession with old photographs suddenly made sense. She wasn't studying history. She was challenging it. The investigation reopened dormant files from 1959. school board minutes, church newsletters, local newspapers. Most contained nothing unusual, until Kellerman found a small article buried near the back pages of the Blackridge Gazette. August 28, 1959. Youth Summer Festival concludes amid organizational changes. 3 paragraphs. Ordinary language. Yet one sentence stood apart. Certain long-standing community partnerships will not continue following recent misunderstandings. Recent misunderstandings. Again. Soft language. Protective language. Language designed to conceal rather than explain. Who writes like that? People preserving reputations. People protecting futures. People burying truth beneath politeness. The pattern had become impossible to ignore. Summer of 1978 brought another strange development. A package arrived at the sheriff's office. No return address. No fingerprints. Inside rested a single cassette tape. No note. No explanation. Investigators gathered around an aging recorder. Static. Wind. Children laughing. Then voices. Young voices. Distant. One belonged unmistakably to Eleanor. Another, according to Margaret, belonged to Thomas Whitmore. The recording lasted less than a minute. Enough to hear one sentence clearly. We promised never to forget. Then static consumed everything. The room fell silent. Never to forget. The phrase echoed across decades. While everyone else agreed to forget. While adults constructed easier stories. While families moved away. 2 children promised memory. Perhaps only one kept that promise. Forensic examination offered little. The tape appeared old. Possibly late 50s. No clues regarding its sender. Another anonymous communication. Another reminder that somebody remained invested in preserving fragments of the past. Robert Kellerman stopped sleeping well. The case occupied every corner of his thinking. Because each answer produced greater mysteries. If Thomas Whitmore was innocent. Innocent of what? If Eleanor spent years revisiting childhood events.
Why now?
Why 1976? What triggered the search? And who feared the truth strongly enough to intervene? Autumn arrived with heavy rains. Pine Hollow Road became nearly impassable. The forests darkened earlier each evening. Blackridge prepared for another winter carrying unresolved grief. Then came the phone call. Anonymous. Male voice.
Calm.
Older. The dispatcher remembered every word. Tell Detective Kellerman that some promises are meant to die with children.
Click. Gone.
The message electrified the department.
At last.
Direct contact. Not letters. Not packages. A voice. Yet technology failed again.
No trace. No identificación.
Nothing. Only another reference to promises. Promises outliving childhood. Promises never forgotten. Kellerman listened to the recording repeatedly. The callers sounded educated. Controlled. Not emotional. Not unstable.
Certain.
As though speaking from conviction rather than fear. That frightened him profoundly. People acting from panic make mistakes. People acting from belief endure. Meanwhile, Margaret Hayes discovered another notebook among Eleanor's belongings. Smaller. Older. A childhood journal. Most entries involved ordinary things.
School. Books.
Friends. Then one page, dated September 1959, changed everything. The handwriting belonged to a frightened child. Tom says grown-ups lie when they're scared. He says remembering matters more than being liked. Nothing else.
No explanation. Tom.
Thomas Whitmore. 9 years old. Speaking about fear and truth with startling maturity. What happened to these children? What event forced such ideas into their lives? Kellerman felt increasingly convinced that 1959 represented the true beginning of the mystery. Not 1976. Not Pine Hollow Road. Not anonymous letters. Those were consequences. The cause lived somewhere deeper. Buried beneath community memory. Buried beneath decades of silence. Winter returned. Another year ended. No body. No arrest. No resolution. The state formally reduced active resources. The Hayes case entered dangerous territory. The territory where investigations become archives, where detectives retire, where witnesses die, where memory itself becomes evidence. Yet Robert Kellerman made a decision. He would not let Eleanor Hayes become a file number. He purchased his own notebooks, used his own gasoline, spent weekends examining historical records nobody requested. Colleagues called it obsession. Perhaps they were right, but obsession occasionally succeeds where procedure fails. One snowy evening in December, he drove to Lake Mercer. The place appeared repeatedly in photographs, in recordings, in memories. The frozen water stretched endlessly beneath moonlight, silent, ancient, watching. And standing there, surrounded by winter darkness, Kellerman understood something that would define the next 30 years of his life. Eleanor Hayes had not gone looking for a criminal. She had gone looking for the truth behind a shared lie. A lie so old that entire families built identities around it. A lie children recognized before adults admitted it. And somewhere, beyond abandoned houses and forgotten promises, someone still believed that exposing the truth would destroy more lives than concealing it ever had. That belief, more than hatred, more than greed, more than violence, might have been the most dangerous thing in Blackridge, Michigan. The third anniversary arrived without ceremony. No reporters, no television crews, no state investigators promising fresh momentum. Only snow. Only silence. Only the familiar ache that had settled permanently over Blackridge. 3 years. Long enough for children to forget details. Long enough for witnesses to confuse memory with imagination. Long enough for ordinary people to begin protecting themselves with selective recollection. Robert Kellerman feared that more than anything, evidence disappears. That is natural. Memory choosing convenience over truth, that is far more dangerous. January 1979 opened with bitter winds sweeping across Iron County. The Hayes family still refused to move. Margaret Still answered the telephone with a brief moment of impossible hope. Their mother still kept Eleanor's winter coat hanging near the front entrance. People called it denial. They called it love. Sometimes the two become indistinguishable. Meanwhile, Kellerman continued digging backward. Further. Deeper. Toward 1959. Toward the summer everyone remembered and nobody discussed. The anonymous phone call from months earlier remained unsolved. Some promises are meant to die with children. The sentence haunted him because promises imply agreement, shared understanding, mutual responsibility. Children make promises every day. Most disappear. Some survive. The dangerous ones survive. February brought an unexpected visitor. Dorothy Miller, 70 years old. Former elementary school secretary. Widowed. Quiet. She arrived carrying a weathered cardboard box tied together with faded blue ribbon. Inside rested forgotten school records, attendance sheets, activity photographs, volunteer lists, ordinary administrative clutter preserved by habit rather than intention. One item changed everything. A roster for the 1959 Summer Heritage Program. The name sounded harmless. Community education, nature walks, reading circles, church involvement. 32 participating children. Among them, Eleanor Hayes, Thomas Whitmore, and another name that investigators had never previously connected to the case, Samuel Granger. The discovery seemed insignificant until Dorothy spoke. Those three were always together. The room became still. Not 2 children. 3. A triangle. Human history rarely follows straight lines. Samuel Granger remained in Blackridge. Owned an automotive repair business. Married. 2 adult sons. No criminal history. No controversy. Perfectly ordinary. Perhaps too ordinary. Kellerman arranged an interview. Samuel welcomed him politely. Offered coffee. Discussed weather. Spoke fondly about childhood. Yet the moment Thomas Whitmore entered conversation, something changed.
Subtle.
A tightening around the eyes. Longer pauses. Careful wording. The detective noticed immediately. Samuel remembered Eleanor with affection. Thomas with hesitation. When asked about the summer of 1959, he stared through the window for nearly 30 seconds. Then answered. People remember childhood differently. Not denial. Not confirmation. An escape route. Kellerman pressed gently. Was Thomas blamed for something? Silence. Did Eleanor defend him? More silence. Finally, Samuel sighed. The adults thought they were protecting everyone. Protecting. Again. Always protection. Always preservation. Protection from what? Truth? Embarrassment? Responsibility? Samuel refused elaboration. Not hostile. Simply exhausted. As though carrying old memories demanded energy he no longer possessed. The interview ended without breakthroughs. Yet the detective left convinced of one thing. Samuel knew more. Much more. Spring arrived. Snow melted. The forests surrounding Lake Mercer awakened. And with them came another extraordinary discovery. Construction workers repairing an abandoned church storage building uncovered several sealed containers hidden beneath floorboards. Old newsletters. Photographs. Community records. Most worthless. One box bore a handwritten label. Summer Heritage, 1959. The atmosphere inside the sheriff's office became electric. History had returned. Page by page. Document by document. Kellerman examined everything personally. Volunteer schedules. Attendance logs. Fundraising reports.
Then.
Meeting minutes. August 30th, 1959. Private discussion regarding recent events involving youth participants. Consensus reached. Matter considered resolved. No further public comment necessary. His pulse quickened. Resolved. Another carefully chosen word. No further public comment necessary. The language screamed concealment. Who attended the meeting? Church leaders. Teachers. Parents. Community figures. The entire adult structure of Blackridge. Collective agreement. Collective silence. The detective suddenly understood why memories remained fragmented. Because silence wasn't individual. It was institutional. Summer brought heavy rains. Roads flooded. The old Whitmore property deteriorated further. Nature continued reclaiming human history with patient efficiency. Yet history refused disappearance. Margaret Hayes made another remarkable discovery. Inside Eleanor's personal library sat a collection of local history books. One volume contained loose pages inserted between chapters. Photocopies. Articles. Photographs. Handwritten notes. Research. Eleanor had been building something. An investigation of her own. The dates stunned everyone. She began collecting material in 1974, 2 years before vanishing. Systematically. Methodically. Not obsession. Purpose. One note, written in blue ink, carried particular significance. If everyone tells the same story but nobody witnessed the truth, whose memory survives? Kellerman copied the sentence into his notebook. Whose memory survives? The question struck at the heart of everything. Communities create narratives. Narratives become history. History becomes identity. Challenging identity creates enemies. Even among good people. Especially among good people. Autumn of 1979 delivered another shock. A retired postmaster remembered Eleanor renting a private mailbox during 1975. Cash payments.
No explanation.
Temporary use. The box remained active for nearly a year. Investigators had never known. The records still existed. Barely. Most contents disappeared long ago. But one detail remained. Eleanor received letters from out of state. Multiple locations. Including Oregon. Thomas Whitmore lived in Oregon. The room fell silent.
At last.
Direct contact. They reconnected. After 15 years. The implications were enormous. Kellerman immediately sought confirmation. Records showed Thomas indeed resided near Portland.
Married. Teacher.
No criminal history. No connection to Michigan since leaving. Or so everyone believed. Had Eleanor contacted him? Had he returned? Was he the man asking questions at Miller's diner one day before she disappeared? The possibility electrified the investigation. Requests were filed. Interviews arranged. Months passed. Winter arrived before answers. And Winter brought something else. The second anonymous letter. Different typewriter. Same restraint. Same confidence. 8 words again.
They chose peace.
She chose memory. Nothing more. Nothing less. Kellerman stared at the page for hours. She chose memory.
Yes.
That was exactly what Eleanor had done. While others accepted community narratives, she pursued forgotten truths. The sender understood this intimately. Too intimately. Whoever wrote the letters wasn't merely observing events. They lived them. They carried them. Perhaps they feared them. December snow blanketed Blackridge. Christmas lights appeared along quiet streets. Families gathered. Children laughed. Life insisted upon moving forward. Yet Robert Kellerman remained inside the sheriff's office late into freezing nights, surrounded by photographs of children smiling beside Lake Mercer 20 years earlier. Eleanor, Thomas, Samuel. 3 young faces. 3 lives shaped by one forgotten summer. He could feel the outline of the truth. Not clearly. Never clearly. But enough. Enough to understand that Eleanor Hayes did not disappear because of something she discovered in 1976. She disappeared because she refused to accept a lie first agreed upon in 1959. A lie protected by adults. Sustained by silence. Passed from one generation to the next as an act of mercy. And somewhere beyond Michigan's frozen highways, one person still believed that exposing the truth would destroy Blackridge far more thoroughly than any disappearance ever could. The terrifying possibility was no longer whether Eleanor had uncovered a secret. The terrifying possibility was that the entire town had helped bury it long before anyone realized what that burial would eventually cost. The year 1980 arrived with a feeling Blackridge had never experienced before. Fatigue. Not grief. Not fear. Fatigue. The kind that settles into communities after years of unanswered questions. People still remembered Eleanor Hayes. They still cared. But caring had become exhausting. New families moved into town with only vague knowledge of the disappearance. Teenagers who were children in 1976 entered adulthood carrying secondhand versions of the story. Memory was beginning to mutate, and Robert Kellerman understood a terrible truth. If he failed now, the original reality might vanish forever. Cases die twice. First in evidence, then in memory. January brought another bitter Michigan winter. Snowdrifts swallowed roadside markers near Pine Hollow. The abandoned Marlow logging camp disappeared beneath white silence. Nature had become an accomplice, covering everything, preserving nothing. Kellerman refused surrender. His investigation increasingly resembled archaeology rather than police work. He excavated history, layer by layer. The newest breakthrough came from Oregon. Months earlier, requests had been sent regarding Thomas Whitmore. Now, finally, responses arrived. Thomas was alive. 40 years old. Married. Father of 1 daughter. Middle school history teacher.
No arrests.
No allegations. No indication of violence. Ordinary. Painfully ordinary. Yet one detail leaped from the report. Thomas maintained a private collection of Michigan memorabilia. Photographs. Newspapers. Community publications. He never stopped preserving pieces of Blackridge. People who willingly abandon the past do not create archives of it. The realization unsettled Kellerman. A phone interview was arranged. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Thomas spoke calmly, intelligently, carefully. He remembered Eleanor immediately. The warmth in his voice surprised everyone. She was the bravest person I knew. Not kindest. Not smartest. Bravest. The choice of words mattered. When asked about their childhood, Thomas fell silent. Long enough for static to dominate the line. Then came a sentence that Robert Kellerman would write down 3 separate times. The adults needed a villain more than they needed the truth. Silence filled the office. A villain. Again. Someone blamed. Someone sacrificed. The detective pressed forward. Who? For what? Thomas refused specifics. Not hostile. Simply resolute. I promised somebody I wouldn't destroy what remained of their lives. The statement felt devastating. Promises. Always promises. The anonymous caller mentioned promises. The cassette tape mentioned promises. Childhood itself seemed constructed around promises nobody dared break. Kellerman asked the question directly. Did Eleanor contact you before she disappeared? Another pause. Then honesty.
Yes.
They exchanged letters beginning in 1974. She wanted answers. She wanted to revisit 1959. She believed everyone remembered something incorrectly. More importantly, she believed somebody had suffered because adults chose convenience over truth. Thomas agreed, but distance had taught him acceptance. Eleanor possessed no such ability. She couldn't leave unanswered questions alone, he said quietly. That was her gift, and maybe her curse. The line disconnected shortly afterward. No breakthroughs. No confessions. Yet the conversation confirmed everything. Eleanor had been conducting a personal investigation for years. The disappearance was not random. It was connected to memory,
to history,
to unfinished business stretching back decades.
Spring arrived.
The 5th year without answers. Blackridge barely acknowledged the anniversary.
No major memorials.
No television crews. The wound remained, but scar tissue had formed. People learned how to coexist with uncertainty. Margaret Hayes never did. She continued preserving Eleanor's home exactly as it had been. Dusting bookshelves, watering plants, replacing curtains. A shrine disguised as ordinary maintenance. One afternoon, while cleaning an upstairs closet, she discovered a small metal box hidden inside an old suitcase.
Locked.
Rust-covered. Forgotten. The key hung from Eleanor's keychain all along. Inside rested dozens of letters, most addressed to Thomas Whitmore. Some never mailed. Others returned. The earliest dated 1974. The latest arrived only weeks before Eleanor vanished. Investigators read carefully, respectfully. The contents transformed the case. These were not romantic letters, not nostalgic exchanges. They were collaborative investigations. 2 adults reconstructing a shared childhood, comparing memories, questioning established narratives, seeking truth. One passage stunned Robert Kellerman. Eleanor wrote, "Everyone remembers what happened to you, but nobody remembers why they believed it in the first place." The sentence captured the entire mystery. Belief without origin. Accusation without evidence. Memory becoming fact through repetition alone. Another letter contained even more disturbing language. If Samuel finally tells the truth, everything changes. Samuel Granger. The 3rd child. The quiet man running an automotive shop. The man who always paused before discussing 1959. Suddenly, he moved from background figure to central witness. Kellerman arranged another interview. This time, Samuel refused. Politely. Firmly. No lawyers.
No anger.
Just refusal. I've spent 20 years trying to protect people, he said. I'm not starting fires now. Protect people. Protect peace. Protect futures. The same philosophy repeated endlessly. The detective left frustrated. Yet frustration contained confirmation. Innocent men rarely speak about protection. They speak about facts. Samuel feared facts. Or feared what facts would do. Summer of 1980 brought drought conditions to northern Michigan. Lake Mercer receded. Shorelines expanded. For the first time in years, areas previously underwater became accessible. Local historians organized volunteer cleanup efforts. Among the debris, a teenager discovered something unusual. A rusted metal tin.
Sealed.
Water damaged. Inside rested children's drawings. Dozens. Summer Heritage Program, 1959. Names written carefully in crayon. Most depicted ordinary things: forests, churches, family picnics. Then investigators found Eleanor's drawing. The image showed 3 children standing beside a large tree. One figure cried. Another reached outward. The third stood between them. Above the scene, childish handwriting read, "We promise to tell the truth forever." The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. Children rarely invent moral declarations without cause. Something happened. Something significant enough to bind 3 young lives together. Something important enough for promises. The public never learned about the drawing. Sheriff Brennan ordered discretion, not secrecy, protection. The distinction felt increasingly meaningless to Robert Kellerman, because every act of protection seemed to create additional mysteries. Autumn arrived with cold rains and falling leaves. Thomas Whitmore sent another letter voluntarily. No prompting, no requests, just one envelope arriving from Oregon. Inside rested a photograph. Summer 1959. Lake Mercer. 3 children. Eleanor, Thomas, Samuel, standing beside an enormous oak tree, smiling. On the reverse side, Thomas had written one sentence. "That was the last honest day we ever had." Kellerman stared at the words. The last honest day. What happened afterward? What transformed innocence into silence? What convinced adults to create alternative versions of events? The questions multiplied faster than answers. Winter approached. 4 years since Eleanor disappeared. 21 years since the forgotten summer. The distances felt connected, like bookends holding the same tragedy. One December evening, Robert Kellerman sat alone inside the evidence room. Photographs covered the walls. Letters occupied every table. Anonymous notes, childhood drawings, fragments of memory. He realized something extraordinary. Nobody involved behaved like traditional suspects. Nobody sought money. Nobody displayed hatred. Nobody gained obvious advantage. Instead, every action revolved around preservation. Protecting reputations. Protecting families. Protecting history itself. The danger wasn't evil. The danger was love directed toward the wrong purpose. Communities sometimes love themselves so deeply that truth becomes an acceptable sacrifice. And Eleanor Hayes, quiet, determined, relentlessly curious Eleanor Hayes, had spent years attempting to reverse that sacrifice. The horrifying possibility settled into his mind with absolute clarity. Perhaps she succeeded. And perhaps someone realized that success would force Blackridge to confront a lie older than most marriages, older than most careers, older even than some of the children now growing up beneath the shadow of her disappearance. If that happened, if the truth finally surfaced, an entire town might discover that the mystery never began in 1976 at all. It began the moment a group of frightened adults decided that peace mattered more than honesty. The 5th winter after Eleanor Hayes vanished arrived with a silence so complete that even longtime residents found it unsettling. No new leads. No anonymous letters. No mysterious phone calls. Nothing. The absence of movement frightened Robert Kellerman more than bad news ever had. Because cases rarely die in dramatic fashion. They simply stop breathing. One day, people realize months have passed without speaking the victim's name. One day, evidence boxes gather dust. One day, memory becomes folklore. Kellerman refused to allow that transformation. January 1981 marked a personal turning point. The detective no longer believed he was investigating a disappearance. He believed he was excavating a lie constructed in 1959, protected for decades, strong enough to survive changing generations, strong enough, perhaps, to destroy anyone who questioned it. The letters between Eleanor and Thomas Whitmore remained his primary focus. He reread them constantly. Patterns emerged, references repeated. Certain names appeared and then vanished. One name, in particular, refused to leave his thoughts. Samuel Granger. Always Samuel. The 3rd child. The witness. The keeper of something unspeakable. Thomas mentioned him. Eleanor depended upon him, yet Samuel remained absolutely committed to silence. That level of loyalty fascinated and terrified the detective. People protect secrets. They do not usually protect secrets for 22 years, unless revealing them threatens far more than individual reputations. February brought heavy storms. Roads closed. Schools canceled classes. Blackridge withdrew into itself. The kind of weather that encourages reflection. The kind of weather that makes old memories louder. Margaret Hayes visited the sheriff's office carrying another box. Small. Wooden. Recently discovered behind shelves in Eleanor's basement. Inside rested newspaper clippings dating from 1958 through 1960. Meticulously organized. Highlighted. Annotated. An amateur historian's collection. Or an investigator's. One article immediately captured Kellerman's attention. July 1959. Community fundraising efforts exceed expectations. Money raised would support educational programs, library improvements, and youth initiatives. The amount seemed modest. $800. Yet the number triggered something. The same amount that disappeared during the mysterious incident described vaguely by elderly witnesses. $800. Not coincidence. Connection. His pulse quickened. For years, rumors suggested a misunderstanding involving missing funds. Nobody remembered details. Nobody wanted details. Now the figure appeared in official print.
Real. Documented.
The detective dug deeper. Additional articles referenced organizational changes. Unexpected leadership meetings. Families withdrawing participation. Always polite language. Always soft wording. Never direct acknowledgement. Communities have a remarkable ability to disguise conflict beneath civility. March delivered another revelation. A retired teacher named Evelyn Carter requested a private conversation. Age had weakened her body, not her memory. She remembered summer heritage vividly, especially the final weeks. Children arguing, parents whispering, church leaders meeting behind closed doors. Then came the sentence that transformed everything. They blamed Thomas because he was easier to lose. Silence consumed the room. Easier to lose. The Whitmores lacked deep local roots. Their business competed with established families. Their departure created minimal disruption. Sacrifice one family. Preserve 20 others. The arithmetic of community self-preservation. Cruel. Efficient. Terribly human. Evelyn admitted believing the accusations at first. Most people did. Adults spoke with certainty. Children accepted authority. Years later, doubts emerged. Too late. The Whitmores had already gone. Life continued. Memory adjusted itself accordingly. Except for 3 children. Thomas. Eleanor. Samuel. They remembered differently. They remembered reality. And reality became dangerous. Spring arrived. The forests around Lake Mercer awakened beneath pale sunlight. Robert Kellerman returned to the enormous oak tree visible in Thomas's photograph. Locals called it Promise Oak. The nickname startled him. Nobody mentioned it before. An elderly fisherman explained casually. Children used to gather there during summers. Make promises. Share secrets. Ordinary childhood traditions. Nothing unusual. Except this particular group. Eleanor. Thomas. Samuel. People remembered them specifically. The 3 keepers. An old nickname. Nearly forgotten. Kellerman stood beneath the ancient branches and felt history pressing inward. Trees outlive lies. Trees remember silently. Somewhere here, decades earlier, 3 children promised to tell the truth forever. Only 2 attempted to keep that promise. And 1 remained trapped between loyalty and fear. Summer of 1981 marked 5 years since Eleanor disappeared. The anniversary received minimal media attention. A brief newspaper column. A short television segment. The world had moved on. Blackridge had not. Not really. The town simply learned how to carry unresolved sorrow without discussing it openly. Margaret Hayes organized a modest memorial gathering. Friends attended. Former students shared stories. The atmosphere felt less like mourning and more like preservation, keeping Eleanor alive through collective memory. Robert Kellerman noticed Samuel Granger standing near the back, alone, watching. He rarely attended public events, yet here he was. After everyone left, the detective approached him.
No accusations.
No pressure, just conversation. Samuel looked exhausted. The years had not been kind. Without prompting, he spoke. We were children. A pause. We thought adults always knew what they were doing. Another pause. We were wrong. Kellerman remained silent. Samuel continued. When Thomas was blamed, Eleanor wanted to fight. I wanted peace. The words landed heavily. There it was. The division. Truth versus peace. Memory versus survival. Eleanor chose truth. Samuel chose peace. The same conflict still defined Blackridge 20 years later. The detective asked the obvious question. What happened in 1959? Samuel closed his eyes. For a long moment, he seemed prepared to answer. Then fear returned. Visible, ancient, powerful. Some stories become foundations, he whispered. If you destroy the story, what happens to everything built on top of it? He walked away. No further explanation. Yet Kellerman understood. The secret wasn't merely personal. It was structural, embedded within community identity itself. Autumn arrived early. Cold winds swept through Iron County. Leaves covered roads leading toward abandoned properties and forgotten memories. Thomas Whitmore wrote again. This letter differed from previous correspondence. Shorter. More urgent. He described recurring nightmares. The same dream for decades. 3 children beneath the oak tree. One crying. One angry. One silent. Adults approaching through the forest. Voices demanding agreement. Demands for forgetting. Demands for peace. The dream always ended the same way. Thomas leaving Blackridge while Eleanor stood motionless beside the tree. Waiting. The imagery haunted Kellerman. Dreams distort reality, yet they preserve emotional truth. Something happened. Something profound enough to scar childhood permanently. The detective began considering possibilities beyond ordinary misunderstandings. Not crime. Not violence. Betrayal. Institutional betrayal. The kind that reshapes lives without producing police reports. Winter approached. 5 years. An entire half-decade. The Hayes case officially earned another label. Cold case. 2 words capable of draining hope from entire families. Margaret hated them. Robert Kellerman hated them more. Cold suggested inactivity. Stillness.
Death.
Yet nothing about Eleanor's mystery felt still. The past remained active. Breathing. Influencing present lives. Anonymous messages proved that. Thomas's memories proved that. Samuel's fear proved that. One December night, Kellerman sat alone examining the children's drawing discovered near Lake Mercer. We promised to tell the truth forever. Childish handwriting. Simple words. Uncomplicated morality. Children understand honesty instinctively. Adults introduce exceptions. Compromises. Necessary silences. Merciful lies. Perhaps the greatest tragedy wasn't Eleanor's disappearance. Perhaps the greatest tragedy occurred 22 years earlier, when 3 children learned that truth and community could become opposing forces. And perhaps Eleanor spent her entire adult life trying to reconcile that impossible lesson. The horrifying possibility continued growing inside Robert Kellerman's mind. Maybe nobody intended harm. Maybe nobody acted from hatred. Maybe everything that followed emerged from ordinary people desperately attempting to preserve peace. History offered countless examples. Good intentions. Catastrophic consequences. And somewhere beyond frozen roads and fading newspaper headlines, someone still believed that Eleanor Hayes should have accepted the same bargain everyone else made. Forget.
Move on.
Protect what remains. But Eleanor remembered. She asked questions. She reopened old wounds. And in Blackridge, Michigan, old wounds apparently possess the terrifying ability to bleed across generations. The summer of 1982 arrived with an irony nobody in Blackridge failed to notice. 23 years had passed since the season that changed everything. 6 years had passed since Eleanor Hayes vanished. And still, the town lived inside both events simultaneously. Children who knew nothing about 1959 played near streets named after families connected to it. Adults who swore they remembered nothing still lowered their voices when certain names surfaced. Memory had become architecture. Invisible.
Permanent.
Robert Kellerman understood that his investigation had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer chasing evidence. He was confronting identity. Because if the truth about 1959 emerged, Blackridge would be forced to reconsider stories passed from parents to children for more than 2 decades. Communities tolerate tragedy. They struggle to survive embarrassment. Especially collective embarrassment. Spring brought a development nobody expected. Samuel Granger requested a meeting. Not at the sheriff's office. Not publicly. At Lake Mercer. Near the old oak tree. The request itself felt symbolic. Kellerman arrived before sunset. The water reflected gray skies. Wind moved gently through ancient branches overhead. Samuel appeared older than his years. Heavy. Tired, like a man carrying invisible cargo. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Samuel broke the silence. Do you know why children make promises? The detective said nothing. They make promises because they believe the world is fair. A long pause. Adults stop making promises because they know it isn't. The words settled heavily. Samuel finally began talking about 1959. Not everything. Fragments. Pieces. Enough to illuminate shadows. The Summer Heritage Program organized a major community fundraiser. Churches, businesses, families. Everyone participated. Money was collected for educational improvements, libraries, youth programs, scholarships. The town celebrated itself. Then suddenly, part of the money disappeared. Panic spread. Adults demanded explanations. Someone needed responsibility. Someone needed blame. Thomas Whitmore became the answer. Not because evidence pointed toward him. Because circumstances did. His family was newer. Less connected. Less protected. The perfect sacrifice. Kellerman listened carefully. The details matched growing suspicions. Yet one question remained. How did 3 children become central to such an adult crisis? Samuel stared across the lake. The 3 of us knew where the money really went. Silence. The detective felt his pulse quicken. At last. Something tangible. Something real. Where did it go? Samuel closed his eyes. Into saving somebody everybody loved. The statement landed like thunder. Not theft. Protection. Not greed. Mercy. Again. Always mercy. Always protection. The same themes repeating through decades. He refused additional explanation. The meeting ended shortly afterward. But the implications transformed everything. Someone important. Someone beloved. Someone whose downfall threatened the community itself. Thomas accepted blame instead. Or rather, blame found him. The truth remained buried. And 3 children carried knowledge into adulthood. 1 left town. 1 remained silent. 1 refused forgetting. Eleanor Hayes. Always Eleanor. Summer continued. The anniversary of her disappearance passed quietly. No major coverage. No public ceremonies. Only candles in church windows and conversations conducted in lowered voices. Margaret Hayes noticed something unusual. Former residents had begun returning. Not permanently. Visits. Short stays. People connected to summer heritage. People connected to 1959. The pattern disturbed her. As though invisible currents were drawing everyone back toward unfinished business. One visitor attracted particular attention. Rebecca Morgan. Former volunteer coordinator. Living in Wisconsin for nearly 20 years. She attended church services quietly. Avoided reporters. Then requested a private meeting with Robert Kellerman. The woman carried guilt visibly. The kind that survives decades. She admitted participating in discussions following the missing funds. Adults gathered. Voices raised. Fear dominated every conversation. Not fear of money. Fear of scandal. Fear of public embarrassment. Fear of losing trust. One person suggested allowing suspicion to remain focused on Thomas. Temporary. Just until tensions cooled. The temporary solution became permanent. Rebecca never challenged it. Most adults didn't. "We thought we were protecting children," she whispered. The detective understood immediately.
No.
They were protecting adults. Protecting institutions. Protecting reputations. Children simply paid the price. Autumn arrived with early frosts. And with autumn came another anonymous package. The first in nearly 2 years. No fingerprints. No return address. Inside rested a small cassette recorder. Already loaded. Already waiting. Investigators gathered once again. The recording began with static. Then voices. Older voices. Adults. Muffled. Difficult to distinguish. One sentence emerged clearly. Thomas must carry this. The town cannot survive another scandal. The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because there it was. Not speculation. Not memory. Not interpretation. An actual voice. An actual decision. Thomas must carry this. The wording revealed everything. Responsibility had been assigned. Deliberately. Intentionally. The tape quality prevented identification. Technology offered no miracles. Still, the emotional impact proved overwhelming. Robert Kellerman drove directly to Samuel Granger's home. No warrant.
No accusations.
Just questions. Samuel listened to the recording silently. When it ended, tears filled his eyes. The detective had never seen that before. Never. "Children hear more than adults realize," Samuel said quietly. "We heard everything." The statement shattered years of uncertainty. The 3 children knew. From the beginning. They understood Thomas wasn't guilty. They understood adults created another narrative. They understood truth had been exchanged for stability. And they promised never to forget the horrifying beauty of childhood morality. Simple. Absolute. Uncompromising. Winter approached. The investigation entered its 7th year. State officials considered permanent archival status. Resources dwindled further. Robert Kellerman worked increasingly alone. Friends worried about him. Colleagues suggested retirement from the case. Move forward. Accept reality. The same advice Eleanor likely ignored throughout her adult life. Move forward. Forget. Protect peace. He couldn't. Because every new revelation reinforced one impossible conclusion. Eleanor Hayes disappeared while attempting to correct a historical injustice. Not through courts. Not through newspapers. Through memory. Through truth. She wanted Thomas Whitmore's name restored. She wanted Samuel Granger freed from decades of silence. She wanted Blackridge to acknowledge what happened in 1959. The question haunting everyone remained terrifyingly simple. Who stood to lose the most if she succeeded? December brought heavy snowfall. The old oak tree near Lake Mercer stood bare against gray skies. Robert visited alone. The place had become sacred in his mind. 3 children once stood beneath those branches and promised honesty. Only one promise survived adulthood intact. He examined photographs again. Eleanor, Thomas, Samuel, young faces, unaware that adults around them were preparing a bargain.
Truth exchanged for peace.
Memory exchanged for stability. One generation protecting itself at the expense of the next. And perhaps, just perhaps, Eleanor spent 20 years trying to undo that bargain. The deeper Robert Kellerman looked, the more unsettling the mystery became. No master criminal.
No hidden conspiracy.
Only ordinary people. Church members. Teachers. Parents. Neighbors. People convinced that one necessary lie would save everyone. History repeatedly proves the danger of that belief. Necessary lies multiply. Necessary silence deepens. Necessary sacrifices eventually demand more sacrifices. Until somebody refuses. Until somebody remembers. Until somebody like Eleanor Hayes decides that peace purchased through falsehood is not peace at all. And in Blackridge, Michigan, remembering apparently carried a price that nobody fully understood until it was already far too late. The winter of 1983 settled over Blackridge like a blanket stitched from old secrets. 7 years. 7 years without Eleanor Hayes. 7 years without an arrest. 7 years of the same questions circling church halls, family kitchens, and empty roads leading toward Pine Hollow. People had stopped asking what happened. They asked why it still mattered. Robert Kellerman knew the answer. Because unresolved truths do not fade. They ferment. They change shape. They seep into future generations until children inherit anxieties they never earned. The Hayes case had become more than an investigation. It had become a mirror. And many people no longer wanted to look into it. January began with administrative changes. Sheriff Thomas Brennan announced retirement.
Age. Health.
Exhaustion. Official reasons. Privately, he admitted something else. I don't know if this town wants answers anymore. The statement stunned Kellerman. Because it carried painful honesty. Answers demand consequences. Consequences demand accountability. Accountability demands courage. Not every community possesses an unlimited supply of courage, especially when confronting mistakes made by beloved people. Brennan left one final instruction before retirement. Don't stop following 1959. Nothing more. No grand speech. Just those 4 words. The old sheriff understood what many others refused to acknowledge. The disappearance began long before Pine Hollow Road. It began with memory. Always memory. Spring brought another extraordinary development. Thomas Whitmore returned to Michigan. For the first time in 23 years. The news traveled through Blackridge faster than storms. People recognized the name immediately. Older residents reacted with discomfort. Younger ones asked questions nobody wanted to answer. Thomas arrived quietly. No media.
No announcements.
He checked into a small motel 30 miles outside town. Robert Kellerman met him that evening. The years had transformed the boy from faded photographs into a thoughtful, weary man carrying invisible burdens. Yet the eyes remained the same. Alert. Cautious. Haunted. The conversation lasted nearly 5 hours. And for the first time, Thomas spoke openly. Not completely, but openly. He remembered the fundraiser. He remembered the panic. He remembered adults whispering in separate rooms. Most of all, he remembered Eleanor, standing beside him when nobody else would, refusing to accept accusations, demanding explanations. The detective asked the question that had lingered for years. Why did everyone blame you? Thomas smiled sadly. The answer is simple. A pause. I was the person they could afford to lose. Silence filled the room. The phrase echoed previous testimonies. Easier to lose. Affordable sacrifice. Necessary burden. Different words. One reality. Thomas explained further. His father opposed several influential families regarding land development near Lake Mercer. Business disagreements. Political disagreements. Nothing criminal. Nothing dramatic. Just friction. When the money disappeared, suspicion required direction. Direction found the Whitmores. The community chose convenience. Adults often do. Children remember forever. Robert listened carefully. Then asked the question Eleanor spent years pursuing. Who actually took the money? Thomas looked away. Toward darkness beyond the motel window. No one stole it. The detective froze. No theft? No missing criminal? Then what happened? Thomas answered with visible pain. The money had been quietly redirected, used to save a local institution facing collapse. An institution everybody loved. An institution whose failure would devastate Blackridge. Church leaders knew. Certain business owners knew. Parents eventually learned. The truth threatened too many people. So another story emerged. Thomas carried the weight. The town survived. At least on the surface. Kellerman felt years of assumptions collapse. The crime at the center of everything wasn't theft. It was deception. Collective deception. The kind committed with good intentions. The most dangerous kind. Summer arrived. Thomas remained in Michigan longer than expected. He visited Lake Mercer, the old school building, St. Matthew's Church, places memory refused to abandon. People watched from distance. Some approached. Others crossed streets to avoid him. The past had returned physically. And physical return forces emotional reckoning.
Margaret Haish met Thomas privately.
Their conversation lasted an entire afternoon. When she emerged, tears covered her face. She shared only one sentence with investigators. Eleanor never stopped trying to bring him home. Home. The word carried enormous weight. Because Blackridge stopped being Thomas Whitmore's home the moment adults selected him as the solution to their problems. Yet Eleanor believed restoration remained possible. Even decades later. Especially decades later. August marked 7 years since her disappearance. The memorial gathering grew smaller. Older. Quieter. Thomas attended. Standing near the back. Unnoticed by some. Deeply noticed by others. No speeches acknowledged him. No introductions occurred. Still, his presence changed the atmosphere entirely. Living proof that forgotten history never truly disappears. That same week, another anonymous letter arrived. Handwritten this time. No typewriter. No disguises. Just careful penmanship. Inside rested a single sentence. She wanted the children to tell the story the adults couldn't. The wording struck like lightning. Children. Plural. Not Thomas alone. Not Eleanor alone. Samuel too. The 3 keepers. The promise beneath the oak tree. Everything connected. Eleanor wasn't investigating isolated events. She was attempting to reunite witnesses. The original witnesses. The children who experienced truth before adults reshaped it. Bobbert immediately visited Samuel Granger. The mechanic appeared exhausted. Watching Thomas return had reopened old wounds. Decades of carefully maintained silence suddenly felt fragile. For the first time ever, Samuel invited the detective inside his home. Family photographs lined shelves. Ordinary life. Ordinary happiness. Built atop extraordinary restraint. They spoke for hours. Night settled outside. Finally, Samuel whispered something he had never previously admitted. We try to tell people. The detective remained perfectly still. The children tried. In 1959, immediately afterward, they told parents, teachers, pastors. They explained that Thomas wasn't responsible. They explained where the money went. Adults listened, then chose another path. A gentler path. A safer path. The children learned a devastating lesson. Truth matters. Until truth becomes inconvenient. Samuel carried that lesson throughout adulthood. Eleanor rejected it. Thomas escaped it physically, but never emotionally. 3 lives. 3 different responses to betrayal. Autumn arrived with relentless rain. Roads flooded. The forest surrounding Pine Hollow darkened early each evening. Robert Kellerman felt closer than ever to understanding. Yet understanding brought new terror. Because nobody involved appeared evil.
No villains.
No masterminds. Just ordinary human beings protecting institutions they loved. Churches. Schools. Community identity. The ingredients of countless historical tragedies. Good intentions.
Fear.
Silence. Compromise. The combination rarely ends well. Thomas prepared to return to Oregon. Before leaving, he handed Kellerman a small envelope. Inside rested an old photograph. The 3 keepers beneath the great oak. But this image contained something different. Adults stood in the background, watching. Serious expressions. Tension visible even through faded film. On the reverse side, Eleanor had written years later. They taught us that peace required forgetting. We taught each other that memory was sacred. Robert read the sentence repeatedly. Memory was sacred. Perhaps that belief defined Eleanor's entire existence. Librarian. Archivist. protector of stories, champion of uncomfortable truths. Everything aligned. Winter approached, once more. 7 years. The official file gathered dust in state archives. Funding vanished. Attention disappeared. Only a handful of people remained fully committed. Margaret, Thomas, Samuel, Robert. 4 adults orbiting a promise made by children long ago. One December evening, Kellerman stood alone beside Lake Mercer. Snow drifted softly through ancient branches overhead. The oak tree remained. Silent. Patient. Witness to generations. He imagined 3 children beneath those limbs in 1959. Swearing honesty. Believing adults would honor the same principles. Believing truth naturally prevailed. Children possess remarkable faith. Life often punishes that faith. The terrifying realization settled deeper than ever before. Eleanor Hayes vanished not because she discovered a hidden crime. She vanished because she threatened a foundational myth, a story entire families needed to believe about themselves. And when people build identities upon carefully edited memories, the return of truth can feel less like justice and more like annihilation. The 8th year began with a storm that knocked out power across Iron County and forced Blackridge into darkness for 2 straight nights. No television, no radio, no distractions, only candlelight and conversation. And in the absence of modern noise, old stories returned. People talked, not publicly, not openly, but quietly, at kitchen tables, inside church basements, on front porches where winter wind carried words into the night. The name Thomas Whitmore surfaced more frequently than it had in 20 years. So did Eleanor Hayes. So did 1959. Robert Kellerman noticed something extraordinary. The town was no longer protecting a secret. The town was protecting the memory of having protected it. That distinction mattered, because admitting the original mistake meant confronting generations of silence that followed. January 1984 arrived with bitter temperatures and a growing realization. The truth, whatever form it ultimately took, would never deliver comfort. Only clarity. And clarity can be brutal. Thomas had returned to Oregon. Samuel remained in Blackridge. Margaret continued preserving Eleanor's home exactly as it had been left. The detective existed somewhere between investigator and historian. His office no longer resembled a police workspace. It looked like an archive. Photographs, maps, letters, children's drawings, anonymous notes, entire walls dedicated to memories older than many active officers. One sentence remained pinned above his desk. They chose peace. She chose memory. He read it every morning, every evening, because it explained everything. February brought another unexpected witness. Frank Delaney, former church treasurer, 81 years old, hospitalized, declining rapidly. He requested Robert by name. The meeting took place inside a quiet hospital room filled with machines and fading sunlight. Frank wasted no time. When people know death is close, protecting old lies feels foolish. The detective remained silent. The old man continued. Yes, the fundraiser money disappeared. Yes, community leaders panicked. Yes, Thomas Whitmore was blamed unfairly. But none of those facts represented the true disaster. The real disaster occurred afterward. Adults realized children knew the truth. Eleanor, Thomas, Samuel. 3 witnesses impossible to control. The solution? Convince them that silence served everyone. Teach them maturity. Teach them sacrifice. Teach them that protecting the community mattered more than personal honesty. Frank closed his eyes. Tears formed. We thought we were raising good citizens. A pause. Maybe we were just teaching fear. The statement devastated Robert, because fear disguised as virtue survives longer than ordinary fear. Children obey monsters reluctantly. They obey loving adults willingly. The consequences last forever. March brought another discovery from Eleanor's preserved home. Margaret found a collection of index cards hidden inside old library books.
Hundreds of them.
Meticulously organized.
Dates.
Names. Locations. Cross-references. Research. Years of research. Eleanor had effectively built her own investigative database. Long before computers made such work easy, one card contained only a single line. If Thomas was innocent, who needed him to be guilty? The question struck like lightning. For 8 years, everyone focused on who committed wrongdoing. Eleanor asked something different. Who benefited? The oldest investigative principle in existence. Follow advantage. Follow necessity. Follow fear. Robert examined historical records once more. Land disputes. Church finances. Political disagreements. Patterns emerged. Certain influential families occupied central positions during every major decision in 1959. Respected families. Beloved families. The kind of people communities instinctively protect. No crimes. No corruption. Just ordinary human beings preserving institutions they genuinely loved. That realization made everything infinitely more complicated. Because villains simplify stories. Good people making terrible decisions do not. Spring arrived. Snow melted. Lake Mercer awakened. And Samuel Granger finally broke. Not dramatically. Not publicly. Quietly. One afternoon, he walked into the sheriff's office carrying a small notebook. Childhood handwriting. Worn edges. A survivor. The journal belonged to him. He had preserved it for 25 years. Never showing anyone. Never discussing its contents. The first pages contained ordinary observations. Fishing trips. School activities. Summer games. Then August 1959 appeared. The tone changed immediately. One entry froze everyone who read it. Mom says telling the truth hurts people. Eleanor says lies hurt longer. The words belonged to a 10-year-old child. Yet they summarized an entire philosophy. Two competing visions of morality. Immediate peace versus lasting honesty. Samuel spent decades choosing his mother's lesson. Eleanor never abandoned her own. Another entry proved even more heartbreaking. Tom cried today. He says everyone looks at him differently now. Children notice social exile with terrifying precision. Adults convince themselves young people adapt. They rarely do. The notebook confirmed something Robert suspected for years. Thomas Whitmore didn't merely lose reputation. He lost belonging. And Eleanor spent her adult life attempting restoration. Summer of 1984 marked 8 years since the disappearance. The memorial service changed profoundly. Attendance increased. Former residents returned. People who avoided discussion for decades suddenly appeared. The atmosphere felt less like mourning and more like confession. Unspoken guilt floated through church halls. Thomas sent flowers from Oregon. No note. No message. Only white lilies. Margaret placed them beside Eleanor's photograph. Nobody commented. Nobody needed to. That same evening, another anonymous package arrived. No fingerprints.
No identifying marks.
Inside rested a single Polaroid. Taken recently. The old oak tree near Lake Mercer. Fresh flowers beneath its branches. On the back, handwritten carefully. We were children. They were afraid. 8 words. Always 8 words. The pattern remained astonishingly consistent. The message carried no threat.
No malice.
Only sadness. Perhaps the anonymous writer belonged to that generation. Perhaps guilt had simply outlived courage. Robert considered another possibility. What if the letters represented attempts at confession? Not complete confession. Fragments. Pieces. Small acts of honesty from someone incapable of full disclosure. Human beings often reveal truth incrementally, especially truth they helped bury. Autumn descended with heavy fog rolling across Pine Hollow Road. The location still possessed power over local imagination. Teenagers avoided it. Drivers accelerated through it. Parents referenced it cautiously. A place transformed into mythology. Yet Robert increasingly believed the road itself mattered very little. Pine Hollow was merely the final chapter. The story began elsewhere. At Lake Mercer. under the oak tree, inside church meetings, inside frightened adult conversations about protecting institutions at all costs. One rainy October evening, Margaret Hayes shared a memory long forgotten. During Eleanor's final summer, she repeatedly used one phrase: "We inherited somebody else's silence." The words sent chills through the detective. Inherited silence. Not created. Inherited. Passed down like family traditions. Like heirlooms. Like obligations. Eleanor understood that her generation received unfinished moral debts from the previous one, and she intended to settle them, no matter the cost. Winter returned. 8 years. The case officially ranked among Michigan's oldest unresolved disappearances. New detectives entered law enforcement having never known a world where Eleanor Hayes existed as anything except a photograph. Robert Kellerman felt age creeping into his own bones. Yet determination remained untouched. One December night, he spread Samuel's childhood journal across his desk. Children writing about truth. Adults teaching compromise. Entire futures shaped by one decision made during a frightened summer in 1959. The pattern had become unmistakable. The mystery wasn't about what happened to Eleanor. Not entirely. The mystery concerned what happens when communities convince themselves that goodness excuses dishonesty. Because most people involved genuinely believed they acted with compassion. They saved institutions, prevented scandal, protected families. The immediate results appeared successful. Until 25 years later. Until Eleanor remembered. Until Thomas returned. Until Samuel finally admitted that peace purchased through silence eventually demands payment. And somewhere in the frozen darkness surrounding Blackridge, somebody still carried the final piece of the story. Somebody who understood that the greatest shock awaiting the town wasn't discovering who harmed Eleanor Hayes. The greatest shock would be realizing that almost everyone they admired had, in one way or another, helped create the conditions that led to her disappearance. Not through cruelty, not through evil, through fear. And fear, when shared by an entire community, can become more enduring than any crime scene ever could. The year 1985 arrived with a strange and unsettling sensation in Blackridge. Expectation, not hope. Hope had been exhausted years earlier. Expectation, the feeling that something unfinished was approaching its inevitable conclusion. 9 years had passed since Eleanor Hayes disappeared. 26 years had passed since the summer that altered 3 childhoods forever. Time, instead of burying the truth, seemed to be pressing it upward. Like roots breaking through concrete. Robert Kellerman noticed the change immediately. People were talking. Carefully. Quietly. But talking. Older residents who once avoided the subject now lingered after church services. Former teachers exchanged memories. Retired business owners asked cautious questions. Silence had begun to fracture under the weight of age. The elderly understand something younger generations often resist. Secrets outlive their usefulness. January brought devastating news. Frank Delaney passed away. The former church treasurer died without offering complete answers. Yet his final conversations remained invaluable. The children knew. The adults chose differently. Fear disguised itself as responsibility. Those truths had become undeniable. At the funeral, Robert observed something remarkable. Samuel Granger attended. So did Margaret Hayes. And unexpectedly, Thomas Whitmore traveled from Oregon once again.
No announcements. No speeches.
Just presence. 3 surviving witnesses to a forgotten moral catastrophe occupying the same church for the first time in more than 2 decades. People noticed. People remembered. And memory, once awakened, rarely returns peacefully to sleep. After the service, Thomas stood outside beneath gray winter skies. Robert joined him. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Then Thomas asked a question. Do you think communities can apologize for things nobody alive officially admits happened? The detective considered carefully. I think people can. Thomas smiled sadly. Sometimes people aren't enough. The words lingered, because Blackridge itself had become a character in the mystery. A living institution carrying inherited choices, inherited guilt, inherited silence. Spring arrived with another astonishing development. A regional newspaper published a retrospective about unsolved Michigan disappearances. Eleanor's case occupied only 2 pages. Yet something extraordinary happened afterward. Letters arrived. Not anonymous. Not threatening. Honest. Former residents wrote about 1959. Fragments. Small memories. Tiny details previously dismissed as meaningless. Collectively, they formed a larger picture. One woman remembered adults gathering late into the night inside St. Matthew's Church. Another recalled parents instructing children never to discuss certain conversations. A retired shopkeeper remembered Harold Whitmore insisting upon his son's innocence with visible desperation. Nobody listened. Or perhaps nobody wanted to. The pattern remained consistent. Truth existed. Acceptance did not. Robert organized every statement meticulously. An image emerged. The missing fundraiser money had not vanished. It had been redirected. Quietly. Urgently. Used to prevent the collapse of an important local institution. The decision protected hundreds of people. Exposing it would have shattered public trust. Someone suggested temporary silence. Temporary silence became permanent mythology. Thomas carried suspicion. The Whitmores departed. Life continued. Except life never truly continues when built upon unresolved betrayal. Summer approached. Lake Mercer glimmered beneath bright skies. Tourists arrived. Children played. The world behaved normally. Yet beneath that normality, something shifted. Samuel Granger requested another meeting. This time, inside Eleanor's preserved home. Margaret agreed. The setting felt appropriate. Memory surrounding memory. Samuel walked slowly through familiar rooms. Books. Photographs. Handwritten notes. Research materials. Evidence of a woman who refused surrender. Tears formed almost immediately. She never gave up on us, he whispered. Us. Not herself. Us. The pronoun mattered profoundly. Eleanor wasn't pursuing personal closure. She was trying to rescue everyone trapped inside the lie, including Samuel, including Thomas, perhaps even including those responsible for creating it. The conversation lasted deep into evening. At last, Samuel revealed another piece. The institution saved by the redirected money was the community library. Ironically, painfully, the very place where Eleanor eventually worked. The library faced closure in 1959. Financial disaster. Structural repairs. Possible bankruptcy. Families panicked. Church leaders panicked. Business owners panicked. The fundraiser money disappeared into preserving it. No theft.
No greed. No personal enrichment.
Just fear. Fear that Blackridge would lose one of its proudest symbols. The revelation stunned Robert. A library. Eleanor dedicated her adult life to protecting the institution built upon that original deception. The symbolism felt almost unbearable. She spent years preserving stories inside walls preserved by silence. The irony bordered on tragedy. Samuel continued. Thomas discovered the truth accidentally. Eleanor learned shortly afterward. The 3 children understood everything. Adults realized they understood. And then came the pressure. Forget.
Move on.
Protect the town. Protect the future. Children carrying responsibilities no child should inherit. August 1985 marked 9 years since Eleanor vanished. The memorial gathering transformed entirely. No longer merely remembrance. Reflection. Discussion. Former residents openly acknowledged mistakes. Not specific mistakes. General ones. Failures of courage. Failures of honesty. The atmosphere felt different. Lighter. As though truth, even incomplete truth, relieved burdens people forgot they carried. Then another package arrived. The final anonymous package. At least, the final one anyone ever received. Inside rested a single cassette tape. No note.
No explanation.
The recording quality exceeded previous tapes. Voices clearer. Recognizable. One belonged unmistakably to Frank Delaney. Another likely belonged to former pastor Harold Bennett. The conversation occurred in 1959. Fragments survived. One sentence silenced everyone listening. "We aren't choosing a lie. We're choosing survival." Another voice responded. "And what happens when the children remember?" Silence. Then, children grow up. They understand sacrifice. The tape ended. No resolution. No names. Just philosophy. Survival over truth. Sacrifice over honesty. The entire tragedy compressed into a few devastating seconds. Robert listened repeatedly. Not because new evidence emerged. Because human complexity emerged. Nobody sounded malicious. Nobody sounded corrupt. They sounded frightened. Terribly frightened. History repeatedly demonstrates the danger of frightened people making permanent decisions. Autumn arrived with brilliant colors spreading across Iron County. Thomas prepared another return to Oregon. Before leaving, he visited the oak tree one final time. Samuel joined him. For hours, the two men sat beneath branches that witnessed their childhood promises. No reporters attended. No public statements followed. Some moments belong exclusively to the people who survived them. Margaret later described the scene from a distance. Two old boys finally coming home. The description broke Robert's heart. Home loved them. Home betrayed them. Home remembered them. Home forgot them. Winter approached. 9 years. An entire era. The official investigation remained open in technical terms. Reality suggested otherwise. Resources vanished. Attention faded. Only commitment endured. One December evening, Robert Kellerman stood inside the Blackridge Community Library. Quiet.
Warm.
Filled with books. Children studying at tables. Families borrowing stories. Life continuing. He understood, with painful clarity, the central irony of Eleanor Hayes. She spent adulthood preserving a library saved through deception. And when she discovered that truth, she didn't seek destruction. She sought acknowledgement. She wanted memory to coexist with gratitude. She wanted honesty without ruin. But perhaps others feared that balance was impossible. Perhaps they believed truth functions like fire. Uncontrollable. Consuming.
Total.
The terrifying question remained unanswered. When Eleanor came closest to restoring what had been broken, who decided that some histories were still too dangerous to revisit? And how far would ordinary people go to protect a version of themselves they desperately needed to believe was good?